my parents told my sister, "You get everything, and you, Everly, nothing." So I made my move. My name is Everly Hargrove. I'm 36 years old, and I was sitting at my parents' dining table on a Sunday evening in April when my mother set down her wine glass and said the words that ended something in me for good. "We've decided the business and the house go to Madison. Everything goes to Madison. You have your own life in the city, Everly. You don't need any of it." My father didn't even look up from his plate. My sister Madison smiled into her napkin, the same small, satisfied smile she'd worn since we were children whenever she got something I didn't. Had spent 11 years building that business alongside my parents. I had wired them money during 2 different cash crunches that would have closed our doors for good. I had signed personal loan guarantees with my own name on them, and that night, at that table, I was told calmly over pot roast that I would receive nothing. What my parents didn't know was that I had kept records. Every wire transfer, every signature, every email, every contract with my name on it, and in 6 weeks, those records were going to matter more than any of us at that table could have imagined. If you've ever been the child who did everything right and still got left out, stay with me, because this story is for you, and if it resonates, please subscribe. Because what happened next changed everything. I grew up the second daughter in a family that ran a small but respected furniture manufacturing business outside Asheville, North Carolina. Hargrove Furniture Co. had been started by my grandfather, passed down to my father, and by the time I was in high school, it was clear which daughter was expected to inherit it. Madison was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were small, she was treated as the natural heir. She got the corner bedroom, she got driving lessons first, at 15 in the good car. When she wrecked that car 6 months later, my parents bought her another one within the week. I remember being 9 years old, standing in the kitchen, watching my mother iron Madison's dance recital costume while telling me my school science fair project would have to wait because there wasn't time before Madison's rehearsal. I didn't complain. That was never really an option in our house. Complaining about being overlooked just got you labeled difficult, and difficult children got less, not more. There's another memory that stayed with me longer than I expected it to, one I hadn't thought about in years until all of this started. I was 11, and I had saved birthday money for almost a year to buy a secondhand telescope from a classified ad in the local paper because I'd been reading about astronomy and wanted to see Saturn's rings for myself. The week before I was finally going to buy it, Madison decided she wanted a new bicycle for a friend's birthday party we were both invited to, something showier than the one she already had. My mother took the money out of the household jar that had, until that week, included the $20. I'd contributed from mowing a neighbor's lawn, money she'd asked me to lend the family temporarily. It never came back. The telescope sale ended, someone else bought it, and my mother told me, almost cheerfully, that I could save up again. You're good at that. I remember standing in my room that night, not crying, just quietly recalculating, the way I would recalculate a budget years later at Hargrove Furniture Co., understanding without anyone explaining it to me that my savings existed to be borrowed, and my patience existed to be depended upon. Another memory, this one from when I was 14. Madison had borrowed, and eventually wrecked, a bracelet that had belonged to our grandmother, a small gold piece with a single sapphire that our grandmother had specifically told me before she passed that she wanted me to have someday, because I was the one who used to sit with her and listen to her stories while Madison got restless and wandered off. When our grandmother passed and the bracelet went missing from her jewelry box, my mother quietly gave it to Madison instead, since she asked for it first, despite what our grandmother had said to me directly more than once, in front of witnesses who apparently no longer remembered when it mattered. I didn't fight that decision either. I told myself it was just a bracelet, that the memory of my grandmother mattered more than any object, and that arguing about it would only make me look petty and grasping in front of a family that already seemed to expect exactly that kind of behavior from anyone who dared ask for their fair share. So I learned to be easy. I got good grades quietly. I paid for my own car at 17. With money from a part-time bookkeeping job at a local accounting firm, a job that, looking back, taught me the exact skill set that would matter most 15 years later. When I graduated with my accounting degree, my father asked if I wanted to come work at the family business. I said yes immediately because part of me still believed that if I proved myself enough, if I worked hard enough, the scale would eventually balance. I told myself that story for 11 years. I started in accounts payable, and within 4 years I was running the entire financial side of Hargrove Furniture Co., a business that, by then, employed 31 people and shipped custom pieces to retailers across 6 states. Madison worked there too, technically, in a marketing role that mostly involved approving Instagram photos and attending furniture trade shows in cities she wanted to visit anyway. I'm not saying this to be cruel about my sister. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the truth is the entire point of this story. There were 2 moments early on that I should have paid closer attention to, moments that told me exactly how this was going to end if I let it. The first was when I was 28. The business needed $40,000 to cover a supplier shortfall during a slow winter quarter, or we would lose our exclusive contract with our largest retail partner. I didn't hesitate. I pulled $40,000 from my own savings, money I had been setting aside for a down payment on a house, and I wired it to the company account. The same afternoon, my father asked. My parents thanked me briefly, and then the conversation moved on to Madison's upcoming trip to a design conference in Atlanta, fully funded by the company. I told myself that was fine. Family helps family. The second moment was 3 years later, when the business needed to refinance its equipment loans, and the bank required a personal guarantor with strong individual credit. My father asked me to sign. Madison's credit, at the time, wasn't strong enough to qualify, something none of us said out loud, but all of us understood. I signed the guarantee, my name on a legal document tying my personal assets to the business's debt without asking for anything in return, not even a formal ownership stake. I remember driving home that night thinking, surely this proves I'm invested. Surely. This earns me an equal seat at the table. It didn't. Nothing ever quite did. Every year around the holidays, my mother would mention, almost in passing, that the business would stay in the family, with Madison carrying it forward. As though I wasn't standing right there having built half of its financial foundation with my own signature and my own savings. I kept surrendering pieces of myself to keep the peace, because the alternative, actually confronting my parents about the pattern, felt like it would blow up the only family I had. The moment I decided no more didn't come from that dinner table announcement. Not exactly. It came 3 days later when I was reviewing year-end financial statements for the business, a task I still handled every January, and I noticed something in the equity documentation that didn't add up. My name, which had been listed as a minority equity holder since the year I signed that loan guarantee, an informal but legally documented 5% stake my father had given me in writing as a thank you at the time, was gone. Not diluted. Gone. Replaced entirely by Madison's name on a restated ownership document dated 4 months earlier, a document I had never seen, never signed, and never been told existed. I sat at my desk in my apartment, staring at that PDF, and felt something shift permanently inside my chest. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was a paper trail. And paper trails can be verified, one way or another. I didn't call my parents that night. I didn't call Madison. I closed my laptop, made a cup of tea, and started making a list, the same way I'd make a list for any financial discrepancy I found. In the business, methodically, without emotion, because emotion was exactly what had kept me quiet for 11 years, and I finally understood that quiet had never once protected me. The next morning, I began building a record, not out of anger, but out of the same discipline that had made me good at my job for over a decade. I started with the equity documentation itself. The original agreement, signed by my father in his own handwriting, dated the year of the loan guarantee, stating clearly that I held a 5% equity stake in Hargrove Furniture Co. in recognition of my personal financial guarantee on the equipment refinancing. I had my own signed copy, saved in a fireproof document box in my apartment closet, a habit left over from my very first year working in accounting, when a senior partner had told me, "Keep copies of everything with your name on it because memory fades, but paper doesn't lie." That single habit was about to matter more than anything else I owned. Next, I pulled every wire transfer confirmation for the $40,000 I had sent during the supplier shortfall, along with the email chain where my father had asked for it and thanked me afterward, an email he'd sent from his personal account, still sitting in my inbox from 8 years earlier. Then I requested, formally and in writing, a full ownership history report from the business's registered agent, the same service we use to file our annual corporate paperwork with the state, because I still had administrative access to our financial systems, a fact nobody had thought to revoke, since revoking it would have required someone to actually notice I might need to be shut out. I was able to pull the restated ownership document that had quietly replaced mine. What I found made my hands go cold. The restated document wasn't just missing my name, it included a signature on the line marked, "Outgoing equity holder consent," that was supposed to be mine, releasing my 5% stake voluntarily. I had never signed that document. I had never seen that document until 3 days earlier. I stared at that signature for a long time. It looked close to mine, close enough that a casual glance might not catch it. But I had signed my own name thousands of times in my life, on checks, on contracts, on tax documents, and something about the pressure of the pen strokes, the slight curve at the end of the Y in Everly, felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully articulate yet. I decided not to trust my gut alone. Before I even called anyone, I spent an entire weekend doing something I probably should have done years earlier, which was building a complete financial timeline of every dollar and every legal obligation that connected me to Hargrove Furniture Co. I pulled bank statements going back a decade. I pulled every email with my father's name on it that mentioned money, ownership, or the future of the business. I made a spreadsheet, the same way I would for any client audit, columns for date, amount, purpose, and documentation, because I had learned long ago that feelings fade under scrutiny, but numbers hold their shape. By the time I finished, the spreadsheet ran 18 rows deep, $40,000 during the supplier shortfall, the personal guarantee on the equipment loan, 3 smaller bridge loans over the years that I'd never asked to be repaid because the business always seemed to need the money more urgently than I did, and countless unpaid hours reconciling accounts on weekends that Madison's marketing role never seemed to require of her. Looking at that spreadsheet laid out in front of me, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully admit before. I hadn't just been overlooked. I had been quietly functioning as an unpaid guarantor and lender for over a decade, propping up a business I was now being told, in writing, belonged entirely to someone else. That realization is what pushed me to stop investigating quietly on my own and bring in someone whose findings couldn't be dismissed as sisterly jealousy or an overactive imagination. I contacted a forensic document examiner, a woman named Renata Kowalski, who had testified as an expert witness in several regional fraud cases. Someone a colleague from my old accounting firm recommended when I explained, carefully and without naming names yet, that I needed a signature comparison done properly, with a written report that could hold up if it ever needed to. I gave her 7 verified samples of my actual signature spanning 10 years, tax returns, the original equity agreement, mortgage paperwork, bank signature cards, and I gave her the disputed signature from the restated ownership document. 2 weeks later, her report arrived by email, 11 pages long, with side-by-side stroke analysis, pressure point comparison, and a formal conclusion stating that the signature on the restated document showed significant inconsistencies with my verified signature samples, consistent with forgery or unauthorized reproduction, and that, in her professional opinion, it was highly unlikely the signature had been produced by the same individual as the verified samples. I read that conclusion 3 times. Then I sat very still in my kitchen for a long time, because the next question answered itself before I even wanted to ask it if I hadn't signed that document. Someone else had signed it for me, and there were only 2 people with both the motive and the physical access to the original paperwork sitting in our office files. I didn't go to my parents with accusations. I went to an attorney first, a business litigation lawyer named Thomas Ferreira, who specialized in closely held family company disputes, the kind of attorney who had clearly seen this exact story unfold in other families more times than he probably wanted to count. I laid everything out for him across his conference table: the original equity agreement, the wire transfer records, the email chain, the restated document, and Renata's forensic report. He was quiet for a while as he read through it, and then he looked up at me and said something I still think about. "Ms. Hargrove, you've already done 90% of the work most of my clients pay me to do for months. You didn't come in here upset. You came in here with a case." He explained my legal position clearly: a 5% equity stake in a company. That, according to the most recent valuation on file with our bank for loan purposes, was worth just under $3 million. Meant my stake alone represented roughly $150,000, a figure that didn't even include the personal loan guarantee I still legally carried on the company's books, exposure I had never actually been released from despite apparently being erased as an owner. That last detail stopped me cold. Whoever had forged that document hadn't just cut me out of ownership. They had left me legally responsible for the company's debt while removing every benefit of holding a stake. In it, I was still liable if the business failed. Simply wouldn't have owned anything if it succeeded. Thomas drafted a formal demand letter, addressed to my father as the majority owner, outlining the discrepancy in the ownership records, attaching Renata's forensic report, and requesting a full accounting of how and when the restated document had been filed, along with immediate correction of the ownership records and formal release of my personal guarantee on the company's debt. He also, quietly and separately, sent a notification to our business bank, the institution holding the equipment loan I had personally guaranteed, informing them that a dispute had arisen regarding the ownership records tied to that guarantee, a standard protective step, he explained, to make sure the bank's own records reflected the pending correction rather than the fraudulent restated document. That single notification turned out to matter enormously, because banks do not like ownership disputes sitting quietly on loans they've extended, and once that letter landed in their commercial lending department, Hargrove Furniture Co. as they received a call requesting clarification before any further disbursements on their existing line of credit would be released. In the days between sending that letter and the family meeting, I kept working, because the business still needed its books reconciled and its vendors still needed to be paid, regardless of what was unfolding underneath the surface. I remember sitting at my desk in the office on the Tuesday after the letter went out, watching my father walk past my open door twice without stopping, something he had never once done in 11 years of us sharing that hallway. I didn't chase him down. I let the silence sit there, uncomfortable and unresolved, because I had spent over a decade smoothing over exactly that kind of tension, and I understood now that smoothing it over too early would only teach everyone, myself included, that the discomfort of accountability could always be avoided if I simply waited long enough and softened my approach. Thomas had warned me this part would be the hardest, not the meeting itself, but the waiting beforehand, the space where everyone in the family would have time to construct their own version of events before the documents forced a single, shared version into the room. He was right. My mother called twice more before the meeting, each call a little more pleading than the last, asking if we could just talk as a family first, without lawyers, a request I recognized immediately for what it was, an attempt to renegotiate the terms in private, informally, where memory and guilt could be leveraged the way they always had been in our house. I told her, gently but clearly, that I was happy to talk as a family, and that the meeting with Thomas was exactly that conversation, simply held in a room where what was said would be documented accurately, for everyone's protection, including hers and Madison's. She didn't call a third time. My mother called me that same afternoon, her voice tight with a kind of controlled panic I had genuinely never heard from her before. Everly, what did you do? The bank is asking questions about the ownership paperwork. Madison says you're trying to sabotage the business out of jealousy. I stayed calm, the way I'd promised myself I would if this moment ever came. I didn't sabotage anything, Mom. I found out my equity stake was removed using a signature I never provided. I hired a forensic examiner to confirm it wasn't my signature. I'm not trying to hurt the business. I'm trying to correct fraudulent paperwork with my name on it. There was a long silence on the line. Fraudulent is a strong word, she finally said. It's the accurate word, I said. And I have a report from a licensed forensic document examiner that says so. My mother didn't have a response to that. The family meeting happened 8 days later at Thomas's office at his recommendation because he wanted any conversation about the ownership dispute to happen somewhere documented, professional, and recorded, rather than around a dinner table, where things could later be denied or reframed. My father came. My mother came. Madison came, dressed like she was walking into a business meeting she intended to win, sitting down across the table with the same small, confident smile she'd worn at that dinner 6 weeks earlier. I sat beside Thomas, my folder of documents in front of me, closed, because I didn't need to perform anything. The evidence would speak, on its own. Thomas opened the meeting calmly, laying out the original equity agreement first, my father's own signature clearly visible from 11 years earlier. Then he laid out the restated document, the one that had replaced my name with Madison's, and the disputed signature on the release line. Then he laid out Renata's forensic report, sliding copies across the table to each of them. My father's face changed as he read it, a slow drain of color I had never seen in him before. Madison's expression shifted too, but not the way I expected. It wasn't confusion. It was the specific stillness of someone watching a story they'd told collapse in real time. Madison, Thomas said, his voice even, can you explain how this restated ownership document came to include a signature that a licensed forensic examiner has determined does not match Everly's verified handwriting samples? The room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical. I could hear the air conditioning cycling on somewhere behind the wall, the faint clink of my mother's wedding ring against her water glass as her hand trembled slightly, the muffled sound of traffic 4 floors below on the street outside. Madison looked at our father, waiting, I think, for him to step in and rescue her the way he always had. For a moment, nobody moved, and I noticed my own hands resting flat and still on the closed folder in front of me, no longer shaking the way they had the night I first found the restated document on my laptop screen. He didn't step in. He simply looked at her and asked, very quietly, Madison, did you sign your sister's name on this document? She didn't answer, right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the confidence she'd walked in with. I was going to tell her eventually. I just needed the ownership clean before the bank refinancing went through. It was going to happen anyway, Dad. You said the business was going to be mine. I said it would be yours, my father said slowly. Not that you could forge legal documents to make it happen faster. I want to be clear about something here, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to feel triumphant, and triumph was never really what I felt in that room. What I felt was a strange, quiet grief, watching my sister's carefully built version of herself come apart, watching my father realize what his years of silent favoritism had actually enabled. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. The documents did what documents do, which is simply exist. Undeniable, unmoved by anyone's excuses. Thomas laid out the path forward with the same calm precision he'd used through the entire meeting. The restated ownership document would be voided immediately, on record, with a formal correction filed with the state and provided to the bank. My original 5% equity stake would be reinstated retroactively, with documentation showing the correction dated to reflect the true, uninterrupted ownership history. Given the forged signature and the personal liability I had carried without proper compensation, Thomas also proposed, and my father, visibly shaken, agreed without argument that my equity stake be increased to 8%, along with a formal, notarized release of my personal guarantee on the equipment loan, replaced going forward by a guarantee split proportionally among all owners of record. Madison would not be removed from the business entirely. That was never something I asked for or wanted, because whatever had happened, she was still my sister, and still part of a company our grandfather had built. But she would step back from any authority over financial or legal documentation going forward, with all future ownership or contractual changes requiring sign-off from an independent third party, accountant, a role the business's board, which now formally included outside advisors at Thomas's insistence, would help select. Before we left Thomas's office that day, my father asked to speak for a moment, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. He said, he had spent years assuming that because I never complained, I never needed anything, and that watching Renata's report laid out on the table had forced him to understand, all at once, exactly how much he had gotten wrong. Madison didn't say much else that afternoon. She signed the documents Thomas had prepared, acknowledging the correction, her hand visibly unsteady, and she left the office before the rest of us, walking quickly to her car without waiting for anyone. I remember watching her go and feeling, underneath everything else, a strange ache that had nothing to do with vindication, the particular grief of watching someone you grew up sharing a bedroom with become, in the space of one meeting, someone you weren't sure you fully recognized anymore. The bank's hold on the line of credit was released within a week once the corrected paperwork was filed, but not before the entire situation had already rippled outward in ways none of us could fully control. Two of our longtime retail partners, who had heard through industry channels that the company had experienced an internal ownership dispute involving falsified documents, began asking pointed questions about our financial stability before renewing their annual contracts. It took months of careful, transparent communication from Thomas's office and from me personally, walking partners through the corrected, verified ownership structure to fully restore that trust. Madison, for her part, spent the following year largely outside the company, taking a marketing role at an unrelated firm in Charlotte, a job she got, notably, without her name attached to Hargrove Furniture Cubbider carrying the same weight it once had locally, since word travels fast in small industry circles, and forged legal documents are not the kind of story that stays contained. I don't know everything. That happened in her life during that year because we didn't speak much, and I made a conscious decision not to reach out simply to fill an old habit of smoothing things over. For the first time in my life, I let the silence exist without rushing to repair it. There was a period, around the 6-month mark, when I second-guessed myself constantly, lying awake replaying the meeting in Thomas's office, wondering if I had been too rigid, too unwilling to simply let my father quietly fix things without ever forcing the forgery into the open, where the bank, our retail partners, and eventually, half the local business community would hear about it. A friend of mine, someone who had no connection to my family at all, asked me once during that period whether I regretted involving the bank so early, since it had clearly caused ripples I couldn't fully control afterward. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't regret it, because the alternative would have meant staying silent about a forged legal document with my name on it simply to protect people who hadn't extended me the same protection for over a decade. Once I said that out loud, the doubt started to quiet down on its own. I also want to mention something that happened about 7 months after the meeting, because it surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. One of our longtime suppliers, a small, family-owned lumber mill we'd worked with for almost 20 years, reached out to me directly, not to my father, and asked if I would be willing to take a more visible role in vendor relations going forward, since, in the owner's words, everyone in this business knows you're the one who actually keeps the numbers honest. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it certainly wasn't a public vindication in the way a courtroom drama might resolve. But it was a quiet, specific acknowledgement from someone with no reason to flatter me, and it meant more to me than I expected it to. The house my parents lived in, which had also been part of the original "Everything Goes to Madison" announcement at that dinner table, was never legally tied to the business dispute, and I want to be honest that I never pursued any claim to it. That wasn't the point for me, and it never had been. I didn't do any of this because I wanted my parents' house or wanted to punish my sister into ruin. I did it because I refused to keep carrying legal and financial risk for a family that had already decided, quietly and repeatedly, that I would receive nothing in return. About 4 months after that meeting in Thomas's office, my father asked to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in years. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I should have protected your position in this family a long time ago," he said, turning his cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "Instead, I let your sister believe she could take what she wanted, because it was easier than telling her no. I did that to both of you, honestly. I made her entitled and I made you invisible, and neither of those was fair. I didn't need that apology to feel vindicated, because the forensic report and the corrected legal filings had already done that work months earlier. But I needed it to feel like healing, and there's a difference between those two things that took me a long time to understand. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and that I loved him, and that I hoped Madison eventually understood in her own time that what happened wasn't an attack on her. It was a boundary I should have set a decade earlier. Today, I still work at Hargrove Furniture Car, though my role has shifted. I sit on the newly formed advisory board alongside 2 independent professionals my father brought on at Thomas's recommendation, and my equity stake is fully documented, notarized, and filed with the state, impossible. Now to quietly erase with a forged signature and a restated PDF nobody thought I'd ever see. My personal guarantee on company debt is proportional now, shared fairly rather than carried disproportionately by whichever daughter happened to have. Good credit and a habit of saying yes without asking for anything back. Madison and I speak occasionally now. Careful, evolving conversations. Nothing like the closeness we might have had if things had been different from the start, but something honest, which in its own way feels more solid than the performance of closeness we used to have. I changed. The locks on my apartment that same year, not because of anything related to the business, but as a small symbolic act for myself, a physical reminder that I got to decide who had access to my life and my resources going forward. And that decision no longer required anyone else's approval. I also, for the first time since I started working at Hargrove Furniture Co., opened a separate personal investment account entirely outside the family's financial orbit, funded slowly, deliberately, month by month, with money I no longer felt obligated to offer up the moment anyone in my family mentioned a shortfall. It isn't a large account yet, but every deposit into it feels like a quiet vote for a version of my future that belongs to me first, and to anyone else only by my own choice, rather than by default. My house is quiet now in the evenings, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, that quiet feels like peace instead of loneliness. I think about that dinner table often, my mother's flat voice telling me I would get nothing, my sister's small, satisfied smile, my father's silence. I don't think about it with anger anymore. Mostly because anger requires energy. I've decided to spend elsewhere now, on the business, on my own life, on the people who actually show up for me consistently rather than the ones I once excused for not showing up at all. What I know now, that I didn't fully understand at 36 sitting at that table, is that setting a boundary and seeking revenge are not the same thing, even though they can look similar from the outside. Revenge wants someone to suffer. A boundary simply wants the truth to be acknowledged and the imbalance to stop. I never wanted my sister to lose everything. I wanted my name back on paperwork that had always belonged to me. And I wanted my family to finally see the 11 years of invisible labor and financial risk I had carried quietly, believing, for far too long, that quiet was the price of being loved. It wasn't. It never should have been. I've thought a lot, in the time since, about the difference between the sister who sat at that dinner table absorbing the words, "You get nothing," without a single objection, and the woman who sat in Thomas's office 8 weeks later with a folder of documents that didn't need her to raise her voice a single time. The documents didn't make me powerful. They simply gave the truth somewhere solid to stand, after years of it being talked over, minimized, and quietly buried under the easier, more convenient version of our family's story. I used to believe that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet, that love was measured by how much you were willing to absorb, without complaint. I don't believe that anymore. I've learned that real peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from clarity, from records that can't be argued with, from finally trusting your own memory enough to write it down and defend it, even when the people across the table are the ones you've loved the longest. Some nights I still catch myself replaying that dinner, my mother's flat certainty, my sister's small smile, and I notice now that the version of me sitting at that table already knew, somewhere underneath the surface, that something in our family had been broken for a very long time. It just took a forged signature on a piece of paper to finally force all of us to look at it directly, instead of around it. If you've ever been the child who did everything right, and still watch someone else get handed the future you helped build, I'd love to know, in the comments, how you found your own version of this moment, the point where you finally stopped surrendering and started documenting instead. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories like Everly's, and share it with someone who needs to hear that self-respect is never the same thing as selfishness. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.